Here tonight is sponsored by Adina and Bernie Fischlowitz in memory of his mother, Bertha Fischlowitz, Bas Yechaya Bas Ephraim Tzvi.
Sorry, it's wrong. This one. Sorry.
And by Feya and Jay Cohen as his chus for Fu Shlema for Yaakov Moshe HaKohen bin Gittel Necha. Fu Shlema should be his chus for Fu Shlema. Le'ilui Nishmas, Leah Bas Yaakov, Hammer, and Tzivia Bas Tevia Konofsky. Parshas Mishpatim, of course, mostly deals with, as the name indicates, Mishpatei HaTorah, the Mishpatim, the laws of the Torah that deal with the interpersonal relationships of society. And therefore that is the focus usually as we review Parshas Mishpatim. But when you take a step back and look at the broader picture of Parshas Mishpatim, things begin to get a bit unclear. Because Parshas Mishpatim really seems to be almost one long tangent. It seems to be a digression of the Torah. The Torah is in the middle of discussing Matan Torah, the experience of Matan Torah. That was Torah, Parshas Yisro. The Torah is explaining Matan Torah and describing Matan Torah. The Torah says, for a moment, Torah at the end of Parshas Yisro, after the Aseres HaDibros, after Klal Yisrael experience some form of Gilui Elokos, the Torah warns Klal Yisrael not to make any Avodah Zarah, but rather just to make a Mizbeach. Then the Torah transitions at the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim into the Mishpatim, the halachas of Bein Adam leChavero. The problem is that right after the Mishpatim, the Torah goes back to describe the experience of Matan Torah once again, as if we were in the middle of discussing Matan Torah, and seemingly, the Torah just transitions right back after discussing the mitzvahs that the Torah, for whatever reason, chose these mitzvahs in particular. Now the Torah goes back and says that the Rebbeinu Shalom told Moshe Rabbeinu, come up to Har Sinai, Vel Moshe Omar, Alei El Hashem, Atov Va'aroi Nodav Aviu V'shivim Miziknei Yisrael V'shtach Avisa Merochok, V'nigash Moshe Levado L'Shem V'hem Lo Yigoshu V'am Lo Yalu Imo. It seems like we have an entire description of Matan Torah again. A different description, perhaps a different part of the experience, but certainly something which should have been in Parshas Yisro, should have been juxtaposed, should have been together with the Parsha of Aseres HaDibros. In fact, Rashi learns, as we all know, that this Parsha happened before. So one has to ask themselves the question, specifically according to Rashi, that it actually happened in Parshas Yisro. Why is the Torah breaking up the experience, the episode of Matan Torah? It's a mind-boggling kasha. Sometimes we don't focus on it because we start Parshas Mishpatim, it's a new Parsha. We forget we're in the middle of Matan Torah. The Torah is not finished with Matan Torah. The Torah is about to go right back to Matan Torah. Nasa v'nishma hasn't been said yet. For some reason we take a break and we say, let's learn Baba Kama, Baba Mitzia, Baba Basra, let's learn Masechah Sanhedrin, let's learn Shorsh Nageches HaPara, and then we'll get back to Matan Torah. It's a very, very powerful question, a question which obviously is trying to communicate a very, very important understanding of the Torah and must be dealt with, must be understood. So let's try to understand the placement of Torah's HaMishpatim, the placement in particular of Parshas Mishpatim, why it's here, specifically smack in the middle of the experience of Matan Torah, and why at this point in Matan Torah, by discussing and by understanding the process that the Torah is trying to take us through. But to do that, we really have to understand a very, very crucial nekuda, a very crucial point that Chazal try to tell us time and time again. If you don't pick this up from Chazal at the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, you're clearly not understanding what Chazal want you to understand from the Parsha of Mishpatim, and it comes through almost in every statement of Chazal, in all the Midrashim and the Gemaras that deal with the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim, Ve'ela Mishpatim Shertasim Lifneim. It seems that Chazal are driving at one crucial point, and that is right at the beginning. Ve'ela HaMishpatim. Why Ve'ela HaMishpatim? So Rashi tells us, Ma Rishonos MiSinai. These were also from Sinai. What are Chazal trying to tell us? Why would we think these are not from Sinai? Clearly, what Chazal are indicating is that you might think that, Kodshim, Tarais, Moyadim, right? All those things which are clearly divine, those are things which came from Sinai. But things which we would refer to in other societies as merely a social contract, maybe those weren't from Sinai. The Rebbeinu Shalom comes and says, no, Ve'ela HaMishpatim. Right off the bat, these are no different than any other mitzvah you learn. These mitzvahs are from Sinai. You might be right that other societies have similar laws, but these halachas are not just another society and not just another set of laws. These halachas are divine. And that's why the Gemara continues to say, Ve'ela Mishpatim. Why is it juxtaposed to the Mizbeach? Because the Sanhedrin has to be next to the Mizbeach. Now, why does the Sanhedrin have to be next to the Mizbeach? The Sanhedrin has to be next to the Mizbeach to communicate this very principle. If it was just a judicial system, just to create a system which society could function to prevent anarchy, so then that has no place in Beis HaMikdash. When the Torah says that Sanhedrin has to be in Lishkas HaGazos in Beis HaMikdash, what the Torah is communicating right next, by putting it right next to the Mizbeach, is that these halachas are divine. These halachas come from the Rebbeinu Shalom. And every psak that the Sanhedrin makes is a psak which is coming from the Rebbeinu Shalom. After all, we know that when Beis Din sits, the Rebbeinu Shalom sits with them. That's another drasha that Chazal say at the beginning of Parshas Ve'ele HaMishpatim. The very word for a dayan in the Torah in this week's Parsha is Elohim. We darshan that word to be both referring to the dayan, and Chazal darshan that same word in the Torah to be referring to the Rebbeinu Shalom, to communicate to a person that these halachas are coming from the Rebbeinu Shalom. These halachas are not like any other halachas which govern a society. These halachas are divine, of course, like any other aspect of the Torah. But not simply that they are divine, not simply that they come from the Rebbeinu Shalom, that they came from Matan Torah, but there's even an added element over here. You see, the very first halacha that Chazal learn out in Parshas HaMishpatim is something which is not even written on the pages of Parshas HaMishpatim. The very first halacha that Chazal deduce from the Parsha of Mishpatim is once again from the juxtaposition between the Mizbeach and Parshas Mishpatim. And what is that? The Baal HaTurim quotes it over here. It's mentioned in the Gemara. It's mentioned in a few Midrashim. That the fact that the last Torah Parsha ended off with the fact that you can't go on stairs to the Mizbeach, and that is juxtaposed to the Parsha of the Mishpatim, teaches us a very important halacha, the halacha of having misunim bedin. Just like you don't have stairs to run up to the Mizbeach, so that too is right before Parshas Mishpatim to say that a person can't rush to judgment. The very first halacha in Torah HaMishpatim, Chazal tell us, is having misunim badin. It's not a coincidence that this is also not only the very first halacha that we learn after Matan Torah, having misunim bedin, but it's also the very first halacha that Rabbeinu HaKadosh teaches us after he describes Matan Torah. Moshe kibel Torah misinai u'misara Yeshua, also describing Matan Torah in Torah Shabbat Peh, the very first halacha, v'heim amru shlosh advarim, having misunim badin. Now, what's behind having misunim badin? Be patient to make sure you get it right. I should get it right? Of course, the Torah has to tell me I should get the halacha right. And there's something specifically when it comes to din that I should make sure not to pass a wrong judgment, but different than if I paskin on a shayla and nida, or I paskin on a shayla and basa b'chalav, there I don't have to be so patient. What is hevi misunim badin coming to teach me? It's much more than just be patient to make sure you get the right halacha. Rabbeinu Yoina describes very, very powerfully. Rabbeinu Yoina says, you know what the Torah is telling you? Hevi misunim badin, Rabbeinu Yoina Meseches Avos tells us, Ve'ech yaskil adam ladases Hashem. A person wants to know what is the greatest window into understanding the Rabbeinu Shalom. Ve'ech yaskil ladases Hashem. How could a person come to understand the Rabbeinu Shalom? Says Rabbeinu Yoina. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, who davar hanimna ach bezois. The only way to know the Rabbeinu Shalom is through dinim. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, that's why the Torah says, Chazal say, Vatam al sha'amra v'misunim v'din kidei lehazir yoiser ala dinim. The Torah is telling you, yes, when it comes to the halachas of dinim, when it comes to Baba Kama, Baba Mitzia, Baba Basra, Sanhedrin, when it comes to the halachas of dinim, you have to be more patient. Why? Because included in these halachas is a greater window into understanding the Rabbeinu Shalom. Yoiser aladinim mishar hara'os sheheim ikr gadol b'yediyas Hashem Yisbarach. Says Rabbeinu Yoina, having misunin badin, because it's not just about getting to the halacha. It's not just about getting to the din Torah. You want to understand the Rabbeinu Shalom. You want to have insight into the Rabbeinu Shalom. The way to do that is through the halachos of dinim. And that's what Yirmiyah Navi says. Haskil v'yodeyosi ki ani Hashem oiseh chesed mishpat u'tzedakah. You want to understand Ani Hashem. You want to understand who I am, says Rabbeinu Shalom. Oiseh mishpat u'tzedakah. Learn the halachos of Mishpatim. Learn the halachos of dinim. Haskil v'yodeyosi. The halacha of having misunim bedin is much more than getting the right psak. The halacha of misunim bedin is you want to understand who I am. Haskil v'yodeya. You want to understand who I am. You have to learn the halachos of Mishpatim. Why? Because the halachos of Mishpatim deal with the world that we live in. We have an understanding. We have lawyers that discuss and fight about these things all day and all night. And through those things which we have a grasp on, the physical world, we could get an insight into Sichli Elukos. There's no greater insight for a human being than the halachas of dinim, the halachas of mishpat. And therefore, the very first thing the Torah tells us in Matan Torah is having misunim badin. Realize that your avenue to understanding the Rabbeinu Shalom is Baba Kama. And the very first thing Rabbeinu HaKadosh tells us after Moshe Kibul Torah Misira Misar Yeshua, you want to understand the Rabbeinu Shalom having misunim badin. You have to learn Baba Kama, Baba Mitzia, Baba Basra, and that's the entirety of Ve'ela Mishpatim. These Mishpatim are not just the Mishpatim to govern your society. This is your avenue to understand Kudsha B'richu. This is your avenue to understand the Rabbeinu Shalom. The Sanhedrin, the Rabbeinu Shalom is going to be sitting with them. They're going to be in Lishkas HaZgazes. This is your avenue to the divine. And that's why Asher Tosim Lifneim. What does Rashi say? Don't just give them the halachas. Because the Torah HaMishpatim is not about the halachas. Don't just make a Shulchan Aruch, says Rashi, tell them to memorize it, and now they know it. No, they have to understand it, because the Parsha of Mishpatim is not just about what's the halacha in Shorsh Noga Chesapara. Parsha Mishpatim is that they have to understand the Havinam Taimei Hadavar, says Rashi, that they understand the reasoning, because through understanding the reasoning behind the halachas, then they will understand me. They'll understand Haskil v'yodeya oisi. Parashas HaMishpatim, Torah HaMishpatim is not just the laws, just the halachas that govern society. But this, the Torah is telling us, is the greatest way for a person to understand the Rabbeinu Shalom Haskell v'yodeya isi, and that's what Chazal want us to understand at the beginning of Parshas HaMishpatim. Once we understand this, I think the ordering where Parshas HaMishpatim is becomes quite self-evident. You see, where are we holding in the story of Matan Torah? The Rabbeinu Shalom comes down and tells us Aseres Adibros, and Klal Yisrael comes to Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayoimru al Moshe daber ato imanu v'nishba. Tell, we want to hear Vayoimru Moshe la'am al tira'u. Right? So the Klal Yisrael comes to Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, "You tell it to us. Va'al yidaber imanu Elokim penamus. We're too afraid to speak to the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's too scary. Vayomer Moshe la'am al tiro. Don't be afraid. Ki levavur nasoyis eschem ba'Elohim uvavur tia yirasa panechem levilti zechtu. Moshe Rabbeinu says, don't be afraid. Vayamod ha'am meirachok. They back off. Moshe nigash elai rafel sheshamu Elokim. What just occurred on Matan Torah? Klal Yisrael just said we can't interact with the Rebbeinu Shalom directly. It's too powerful. We have to send Moshe Rabbeinu. And the response to that was, if you can't think you could interact with me directly, I have a warning. Don't think you can make an intermediary. Don't make an intermediary. Don't think that we tried contacting the Rebbeinu Shalom. We tried listening to him. We're physical human beings. We can't interact with the divine. What's the obvious next step as we see from Cheder Egel? You try to build Elohei Masecha. So the Rebbeinu Shalom tells them, first thing, you think you can't communicate, you're sending Moshe Rabbeinu. Lo yisasun iti Elohei Chesed Elohei Zav lo sasu lechem. Don't think that now we're going to transition into having an intermediary Avodah Zarah. No, we're going to have a Mizbeach Adama, and B'chol Makom, and wherever you ask me to come, there I will come. But now you're left with the question. If you can't handle my divine presence directly, how do you access me? How do you know me? How could a physical, mortal human being comprehend the divine, comprehend Sichli Elukos? How could we interact with the Rebbeinu Shalom if we just experimented trying to listen to the Torah directly mipiv, and we simply, our physicality simply didn't allow us to? What's the answer to that? How are we supposed to understand the Rebbeinu Shalom? Comes the Torah and says, Ve'ele hamishpatim, you still will have the ability to do it. Not directly, but haskel v'yodeyo, you will have the ability to interact with me and to understand me and to comprehend me through your understanding of Torah's HaMishpatim, having Mesunim Badeh. If you take it seriously, patiently, you realize that there's much more here than just a social contract, but there's what we're discussing over here is your window into the divine. This is the response to Klal Yisrael saying we can't interact with the Rebbeinu Shalom directly. Rebbeinu Shalom says there's no intermediary necessary. Don't build an Elohei Chesed, Elohei Zav. The way you're going to interact with me is through Torah's HaMishpatim. Through Torah's HaMishpatim, that's Haskel v'Yodeya, I see. There is no better place for Torah's HaMishpatim than right over here, where the Torah comes, where Klal Yisrael comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and says we can't do it directly. So now the Rebbeinu Shalom has to give us an option. So how do we access you? The answer to that is Haskel v'Yodeya. You see, it says Yirmiyah Novi. The answer to that is having Mesunim Badin. Learn these halachas well, and you will understand the Rebbeinu Shalom. And it's almost explicit in the Torah that together with Torah's HaMishpatim comes not only the halachas, the social halachas, but comes the understanding of the Rebbeinu Shalom. This, in fact, at the end of the parsha, when the Torah goes back to discussing Matan Torah, the Torah says, "Vayavam Moshe v'yisaper la'am es kol divrei Hashem ve'es kol ha'mishpatim." Moshe Rabbeinu tells them the mishpatim, and what was Klal Yisrael's response? Kol advarim asher diber Hashem na'aseh, we will do. Moshe Rabbeinu says, no. Vayichtov Moshe es kol divrei Hashem. They said, we'll do the mishpatim, we'll do what you want. And he begins the process of the gerus of Kaisar. What is the Sefer HaBris? Says the Svarno Sefer HaBris was the Sefer with Torah's HaMishpatim in it. Ve'ela HaMishpatim, that was Sefer HaBris. Vayikra ba'oznei ha'am. Vayoymu kol asher diber Hashem nasa v'nishba. Now it's nasa v'nishba. What happened? A minute ago was nasa. Moshe Rabbeinu says, you don't understand. Torah's HaMishpatim is not just about doing. It's not ve'ela mishpatim. These are more halachas. This is the Sefer HaBris. This is the covenant between me and you. This is about you understanding me. This is about Haskel v'Yodoya. See, it's not just about Nasa, it's about the Nishma. To which Klal Yisrael respond. Now we understand that dormant, underlying all these halachas of Mishpatim, underlying the Torah's HaMishpatim is Haskel v'Yodeya. You see, the Rebbeinu Shalom in this bris is not just about doing what he says, but this bris is about getting to know the Rebbeinu Shalom, like a Kiddushin. then Klal Yisrael respond. Now that we understand the depth of Torah Mishpatim, Nasev and Nishma, not only will do, but we will do our best to understand. There's no greater place for Parshas Mishpatim than smack in the middle of Matan Torah. We began Matan Torah, but things shifted very quickly. We couldn't handle it. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, okay, so this is the way you're going to contact me. This is the way you're going to interact with me. You're going to get clarity on who I am. Haska v'yodeyasi. It's going to be through the understanding of the Mishpatim, understanding the halachas that interact of tzedakah, mishpat, and chesed. And the Rebbeinu Shalom says, and this is going to be our bris. Our bris, this is how you're going to get to know me. This is how you're going to live your lives, trying to understand me better. This is turned into Torah Mishpatim, not just a code of law, Chalil v'chas, but a Sefer HaBris. Sefer HaBris, not just that we're Nasa, that we do, but that we try to understand Nasa v'nishma, to accomplish the Pasuk in Yirmiyah, Haska v'yodeyasi, our greatest window into the Seichel, the Sichli Elukus of the Rebbeinu Shalom.